Now the recording has started, and I'm Sudha Jamthe, and we are here at our weekly Wednesday, and we are going to talk about an exciting topic about AI. We've been talking about AI for many weeks, but we are going to talk about what really works, what doesn't work, from an expert from industry who's a practitioner for many years. He's actually a cognitive IoT expert and an exec who has built organizations to go deliver this for many, many years. So let me make sure Sai Allavarpu is here. It's very hard to
I'm
catch
here.
him.
Yes. Hi, Sudha.
Thank you for joining us, Sai. We are going to keep this as a live Q&A. And just to give you context, we have people who are who have taken, my AV class in the past. We have a series of online classes going on. So we have, in fact, we have David Kerrigan, who is author from the AV AI world, who's joining us from Ireland. We have an international mix of people from Mexico, from Ireland, I mentioned. I saw Karsten, who's an entrepreneur who supports manufacturing industry with IoT solutions for connected products and assets, industry assets, who's joining us from Germany. And Mamta here is actually a AI product manager leader and has come and spoken in our Stanford class before. So what I want to do today is just keep it focused on, I'll keep it as a live Q&A so we can get best value from Sai's experience. And I think that 1 hour is not going to be enough. One of the things, I'm saying this for Sai to understand where the students are coming from. The students are not programmers, they are business people, product managers, even 1 or 2 who are from a coding background are interested in the business side of how AI really works. And recently we've been doing an online course on actually building an AI as a business user. So I have this new course called Data Science for Business User that's coming up. And we have one called Capstone Lab, where they took an industry problem and went through the whole exercise of converting that from a business problem to a problem statement. It was an amazing 4-week exercise. And then they did some data scrubbing and then did some model fitting using some no-code AI. But the bulk of the experience was how to take the business problem and how to arrive at different use cases and how can they actually solve for anything. And in that, they basically wanted to know how does it work for real in the industry other than the problem they were solving for, which was one industry example. So without further ado, let me pass it on to Sai. Where is Sai? I want to make sure I can see him on screen. I'm going to pass it to you. So I'm going to see if I can pin your video. Okay, perfect. You're on screen. So Sai, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, because you have this expansive experience in industry. So it gives us context.
Yeah, first, Sudha, thanks for having me here, talking to a pretty good set of accomplished people here. So it should be a good dialogue that I'm expecting here. Exchange back and forth of ideas, discussions, and learnings here. I've been in the Silicon Valley all my life here in the Bay Area. I am through and through a digital native, if you will, or a digital expert. Worked through many different industries and in many companies. In the good olden days, started off my career in engineering, but quickly moved on to the business side. Between a group of startups, as well as some large public companies along the way. Everything from Sun Microsystems, which is now, of course, Oracle, to HP, to Citrix, and then spent some time in a few startups. Then went back to some of the corporations where I could take digital from the high-tech companies that have progressed and adapted digital in a more meaningful way to create some impact, not only on their businesses, but for their communities around them. And take that to other industries that we're kind of trying to catch on to this bandwagon, if you will, of digital in general. and try to learn and how to apply AI, big data, IoT, cloud, and all these emerging disruptive technologies, if you will, to solving some real problems in multiple different industries, everything from home automation to energy to utilities to aerospace to industrials, warehouses, supply chain, and more recently, uh, expanding that into pharmaceuticals, biotech, medical diagnostics, healthcare, and so on. So that in summary is my quick background. I think Sudha already shared the various companies that I have worked at in the past. Today, I'll be representing myself. So full disclosure and disclaimer here, I'm not representing any of my current or former employees. So all the discussion that I'll be sharing will be on my own behalf with some examples from the specific industry and not specific to any given company.
Okay, that's fantastic. I mean, that you're not talking about your specific company is good for us because we get to, hear about your general experience, which is more valuable.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, everybody here is interested in AI in some form. So why don't we get started? Pick any industry, right? We have two projects that we've been working on. One is asset tracking in industry. So I want to go to that. There are so many industries, last week we had a speaker about robot testing in a warehouse. And with COVID situation, supply chain has picked up big time. Medical is another field. Pick one of those fields and tell us, what you have seen, what you have done, or what do you think is happening in AI, just to set the context of what we are talking about AI applications. And then we'll get into the actual challenges of building products and good and bad stuff.
So yeah, different industries in the last 6 or 7 years, different industries, if you will, are at different stages of AI.
Yeah.
Right? Some are way further ahead, some are trying to catch up. I would say if you look at financials, retail, for that matter, or some of the B2C areas, you see AI being used more successfully.
Yeah.
And when I say successfully, not just from a technology standpoint of view or a product point of view, but more importantly, from creating successful outcome for their businesses, creating net new revenues and net new businesses, in some cases, completely revamping market categories. Right? Then you see the other set of industries that have caught on over the last 4 or 5 years, mostly in supply chain, industrials, and logistics. And when I say industrials, I include most of the typical sectors that are included in the industrial vertical, everything from aerospace as an example, right?
Yeah.
Aircrafts, aerospace, manufacturing facilities. You can think about heavy industrials like agricultural equipment or construction equipment vendors and manufacturers. So these go along the breadth. And most of those industries probably were the next, I would say, category or the group or cohort of industries where AI has slowly seen after some ups and downs over the last 5 or 6 years, they're starting to see the benefits in terms of real business impact, especially if you consider in industrials. One is on the manufacturing factory floor side, how AI is being used very effectively to manage everything from improving the production cycles by reducing, for example, testing and quality assurances.
That's exactly the use case. I swear I had not spoken about this to Sai, but that's exactly the use case that we are working on the capstone project on the testing cycle. How do you bring in AI for tracking an asset? So one is general defect detection, which could be just anomaly detection to see for defects either in a power line or manufacturing product to check for defects, right? The other is to actually take the testing process to bring in safety in it. So let us take a step back. What is the most common use case of AI application that you're seeing? When you're saying AI product, you're talking about building a product or a solution in an application setting, right? So give us an example of a typical product that you've been through the whole cycle that you want to talk about.
So I think this is the common myth, Sudha, in the industry, that there is a typical product or a solution that you could apply in multiple
Yes.
different industries and domains. The reality is every domain is different.
That
Right?
causes
Every
a
industry.
challenge. That causes a
Yes.
challenge. So in my AI class, one of the first exercise I put the students through is to understand there are two AI markets. So when they are seeing Silicon Valley talk about AI, they're talking about AI product. It's a technology product which is productized with an API, which is then sold to an industry where it becomes the product or the solution, right?
Yeah.
Becomes a real solution. So I talked to them about how that market. So if you're going and working for a company or talking to them and you're saying, I'm productizing AI, that's a different product if you're building technology, and it's still not solving the problem unless you're solving a customer problem, right? And then the other thing that we've been working on in recent times is what you're an expert in, is to actually make it work and create that business impact. So either to improve some operations or to increase revenue, or you made a list of companies in industries in the beginning saying it disrupts and creates something totally new. That's the true innovation space that we are all very excited about. So what would you pick? Would you say supply chain is impacted most, or where is it? People don't start with AI to start, right? They always start with hey, we have a problem. So, and AI could be the solution. Many times AI is the solution. So walk us through an example where you had a problem you want to solve, and then AI happened to be the solution, and then you kind of, went through the whole thing. Walk us through. So we want to
So that the way we do it, the way we have done across all these multiple industries is, first and foremost, think about, are you trying to solve three broad categories or types of solutions, problems? One is internal facing. What I mean by internal facing is you're trying to use AI and data to solve some internal operational efficiency problems. It could be an operational efficiency. It could be something that is just not possible, that AI makes it possible. And focus in these scenarios from a business point of view is about efficiency and productivity, which means it's more about saving money rather than making money. So this falls into the category of save money type of AI applications. Then you have the other type of applications called making money applications. They tend to be more external facing. Either they could be facing the supply chain partners, distributors, suppliers, and so on. Or it could be all the way further down to your end customers and users. That could be enterprise users, enterprises, B2B. And in most of the industries, it's typically around B2B. There are a few with B2C, even in the enterprise scenario, but they tend to be a tiny fraction, if you will, in terms of real economic value that is being created. So if you look at these three types of solution, internal facing, external facing, and there is something in between. Supply chain tends to be kind of straddling both, internal and external, right? So we first identify what is the business objective and purpose is there, right? If it is saving money or making money. And no one is more important than the other. So don't want to give the impression that making money is more important than saving money. In fact, in many of the industries, I think the ones that fail, they tend to focus and jump very quickly to making money when there are some low-hanging fruit about saving money and proving the value to the stakeholders and the leadership and the board and the CEO, if you will. Demonstrating that value quickly will actually change the organizational culture and mindset and dynamics to see value behind the AI. It's kind of like crawl, walk, run, right? And then in some cases, we do explicitly, especially if there is a customer demand or if there is a competitive threat, we focus on making money initiatives, which are more external facing AI solutions. So we try to frame the problem first. Is it internal or external? Most of the internal problems sometimes tend to be more horizontal in nature. Things like I mentioned in supply chain, if you're, on manufacturing floor, everything from asset tracking, asset management, asset utilization to manufacturing yield and quality, for example, right? These are the types of problems where AI can be used to solve, and these are horizontal. And what I mean by horizontal is you can build a solution for one particular domain or industry or a vertical, and you can take largely the same approach in some other industry and vertical. okay, and still apply. There will be some differences, but they're largely portable.
So the tech companies who come with an API typically want to build some platform. So they want to go to automotive, go solve for a problem, and then they try and go to customers. They develop a case study, and then they want to go to everybody else, right? How
They
does
tend to be
that
more
play out?
horizontal. Yeah, they tend to
Right.
be a little bit more horizontal.
Yeah.
And the tech AI products tend to be, first and foremost, they target the developers, the
Yeah.
data scientists, the
Yeah.
architects, and so on. They have a different market they're going after, right?
Yeah.
Even if the developer or data scientist sitting in a medical hospital or a factory floor in industrials or utilities or energy, power, and so on, they're still targeting the developers. Then you have the other type of AI products and solutions that kind of horizontal. In other words, they could create a solution for supply chain optimization for asset tracking or management. They
Yeah.
could create, and that is not truly horizontal, but horizontal probably within a given domain. If you are all tracking all agricultural equipment vendors with a solution, then
Yeah.
it tends to work out like that, right?
Yeah.
But you can't take that and say that it is going to apply in a vaccine manufacturer's factory plant. It
Yeah.
doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah.
So those are the kind of the next level of horizontal portable solutions, AI solutions that apply across industries. Then the next level, where is the real solution happening, especially not internal facing, but external facing solutions, they tend to get more and more what I call tailored to particular vertical, particular like a hospital,
Yeah.
as an example, or a aircraft manufacturer, or an agricultural equipment manufacturer, or a utility operator,
Yeah.
right? These are very specific solutions for specific problems, not only in their domain, but now you're getting into specific problems in their companies. So here you see there are very few opportunities, at least today,
Yeah.
to create truly horizontal solutions where you can create a product, create an API, and say, go sell it across multiple customers. That is very rare at that point in time. So first and foremost, to be successful, you need to identify where this falls, right? And if you already have a company that you're working in and they fall into one of these categories, great. If you're trying to start a new company or a new business, make sure you understand where does this fall, and then you work down from that.
So you mentioned something about demonstrating value to the shareholders and management, and I'm
Yeah,
seeing a question here about how would you recommend you show the ROI of AI
in the
from a product, right?
yeah,
And it could be B2B or B2C. His
yeah. So this is the most common question I have faced, and the way I have approached this was to up-level the conversation. Because if you are struggling to try to demonstrate the ROI of an AI in sales or a product to your management, to your board, or to your CXOs, you are probably too late in the game to convince them.
What does
And
that mean?
what does that mean? Yes. So what does it mean by that is, you should not have to demonstrate the ROI of an AI in the first place to get the buy-in of your leadership. And that means you need to lay the groundwork way before you have the conversation of an ROI of an AI product. Because most of the AI, unless you're in a tech company today, in the tech companies have already gone way beyond understanding the importance, relevance, and the impact of AI. They don't need to be convinced. So they're going to move ahead with AI solutions, and they'll ask questions like ROI right up front. And then other scenarios in other industries, which are not as quite progressive as the tech companies, they are still struggling to even understand if AI will be useful for my business, and if so, how. Before they get to ask the question of, is there an ROI? So for example, the way we have approached this over the last 6 or 7 years is focus a little bit more upfront investment, time and investment, in creating a very comprehensive, kind of like a learning tour, if you will, for the key execs in your business unit or in your company, sometimes all the way up to the CEO. create what we call learning tours. You identify who are the best of the best in specific but relevant industries for your company and the business. Take them around or invite those speakers, or you take these execs and have them give them a tour of those other companies to elevate their understanding and importance of how others are using AI to create or transform their business models. What could they learn from those companies and apply to their own companies? That approach has proven, especially outside the tech companies world, non-tech companies, that approach has proven to be more successful in all the industries that I mentioned earlier. The next thing you will be thinking about is use those same learning tools to think about what is the competitive threat of inaction.
So I have been invited to talk to a group of execs typically, or sometimes a whole board of directors, about autonomous vehicles and how is it going to impact their industry, or AI and what does it mean. And they are always interested in comparables of other industries on what they're doing. But when I get to the place of you need to move, or here is the threat, they get very uncomfortable. Usually they don't like those conversations. Most of the times they're kind of in denial. It takes a few cycles.
No, they tend to be denial, but depends on which people you talk to. What I have learned is most companies, the senior most leadership, especially the CXOs, the board and the CEO, they tend to be more humble in a very different way. And what I mean by that is, while they're very confident and accomplished in what they're doing, they tend to be humble in the sense it is the BU leaders who and the middle management who are not comfortable, or they try to avoid having those conversations because they feel like, okay, who is this person coming and telling me that my business is a threat? I know more about my business than what you know, right? So that's the common thing. So what we have found successful when we do this comparative tours is to frame the comparative discussion with relevant. I mean, you can't just use an example of Tesla and then go to a medical hospital because there's absolutely no connection. They will say, hey, I get the Tesla example. What do I do with that in a hospital? Yeah, I get the Tesla example. What do I do in this? I'm a utility operator. What do I do with this? So you have to make this comparative threat a real example, right? And make it relevant. The senior leadership tends to respond to that first before they start slowly changing the mindsets about, okay, how does AI add value to my business? That is when you need to think about some quick wins and trials. It is okay to think big, but start small, because senior leadership usually in other industries outside tech, they don't have the appetite, I call the patience capital. Unlike the tech companies that can flow millions and millions for 5 years, 10 years, 20, 15 years until they get it right, or like startups who go around 6 or 7 years before they go public. Most of the companies typically give only 2 or 3 years, which means you still have to have that big aspiration and the roadmap and the vision, but show some real practical quick wins that can happen within 9 months or 12 months with some demonstrating what are those KPIs for your business, what are those metrics. And your question was around ROI in sales, right? And that is the conversation you need to be having in terms of framing the discussion, saying AI right now in industries that they have not adopted AI is more foundational and an enabler, unlike in high tech. And that means use a different set of metrics: adoption metrics, trial metrics, usage metrics, and some other relevant metrics before you get to the financial metrics. And I think this will probably one of the tougher conversation. And that is the reason why I said you need to have that education and inspiration campaign for the senior leadership, even before you have the dollars and cents conversation. Otherwise, you're not setting them up to ask. First, you're not setting your leaders to be in the right frame of mind. Two, you're not setting up them to be in the right, help them ask the right questions. And so in the absence of that, they fall back to what their comfort zone is, which is, I know how money talks, so show me how much ROI, how much revenue will you make, and how much profitability. And then you have to give relevant examples of how long it took in relevant startups for your particular market or sector that you're operating in. And if you show that at a very detailed level, not fuzzy high level PowerPoint kind of stuff, but real, What we have noticed in leaders in other industries, they are very open-minded, especially the senior leadership.
Yeah.
Middle
Yeah.
management will continue to resist change.
Yeah.
Middle management, you should expect a lot of resistance. That is a given, because
But
they're
when
not
you
gonna.
say go deeper, you have to build pilots, and that is where 85% of AI pilots fail. And
Yeah.
one question I get from industry, and these are typically BU heads kind of people who basically say, I know AI is useful and I know AI can create value. I have read about possibilities. They even have some application example they would give me, but they don't see that working in their company because the effort is scattered. This is not like somebody who's running an innovation center. This is somebody who knows that some particular application of AI can solve some kind of operational efficiency. But then the data scientists are doing something else. So I think there's a disconnect between the language of the data scientists and the business users that is might be causing a problem. So what do you see as the reasons why 85% of AI projects, the pilots especially, fail? What do you think is the reason, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, so I think there are a few different dimensions why they fail, right? First and foremost is the lack of understanding. It goes back to the learning tool I was mentioning earlier, right? Which is, they may have read about it in Wall Street Journal or some other business magazine. Hey, AI is good. CEO or says to his lieutenant, hey, why don't you go do this thing and start something? That person will go start up a small group of data scientists and engineers, put them together and do some experimentation. And to say that we are doing some real business driven solutioning, they'll probably have one or two product managers who go talk to some other one or two product managers in the real business units, while this group is right in the center. And in that whole process, they tend to think very incrementally. And two, they don't apply the same rigor they apply to their other products, which is truly understanding customer workflows, customer processes.
Yep.
Before you even try to solve and decide where to apply AI in that customer process. Their process, customers' processes or workflows may have multiple steps. Which of those steps are you going to tackle and solve with AI first? Right? It's kind of like the supply chain example we were talking earlier. If you're talking in a manufacturing factory floor, you're talking about the assembly line. It goes through multiple stages and steps, and at some point, once the widget is being has already been built, somebody will have to do the inspection, quality, and audit and everything. At that point, they come out with multiple different lots, and some of them will be discarded. Some of them will continue along the line. Then you have issues like scrap, yield, productivity, time, and so on. So somebody who knows that entire workflow at a much detailed level than what I just explained, much more granular level, will be able to better say that, hey, you know what, I can apply computer vision here, and I can apply regular analytics here, right? And try to see how I can shrink some of those steps in the processes.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, not only save money, but also increase the yield and the output and avoid having to shut down the whole assembly line because you suddenly realized, hey, all the lots that are coming in are defective. So you'll have to stop the entire thing. It costs money, blah, blah, blah. But the whole idea is having that level of conversation and investment means you have to invest some time in your customer VOCs and workflow understanding, not just sitting inside the building and then you have to go to actually a real factory floor and see it and watch it for yourself. Then you learn. Same thing within hospital. Same thing if you're trying to make insurance claims in utilities, as an example, right? You have to go there to understand, and that's where the companies tend to underinvest because they think they can put a bunch of engineers and data scientists together in some ivory tower, if you will, and they can go somehow come out with a magical solution.
Yeah.
That's one. Second is understanding the corporate culture and the fit of AI. AI can fit in any corporate culture. You just need to understand what is your company's culture. There are some companies who are very, very risk averse. They're willing to make big bets, bold bets, and invest in something new in innovation and growth. There, it's much easier to convince and do ROI and things like that. In other ends, there are some companies who tend to be more conglomerates. There are other types of companies who, like some of our tech companies in the Bay Area, right? They are more acquisition driven, M&A driven. The only way they tend to grow is through acquisitions. So in that scenario, as an example, trying to push a organic growth of AI solution may not fit with that corporate mindset or the corporate culture because they tend to be more acquisitive in nature.
Yeah.
So first you understand that, then you apply the right solution. If M&A is the right solution to build AI solutions or acquire AI into your company, so be it. If your company tends to grow more organically, all the innovation, then you build your own organizational structure, your own data scientists, your own product managers, and then do it differently. So this is what I mean by the misfit of sometimes organizational structure and culture with the corporate culture tends to set this up right up for failure or success right in the beginning. And then even if it is satisfied, there are other things that tend to go wrong, right? One is talent. Having the right cross-functional talent in these teams is important. We cannot have siloed functional talent like, hey, here is a data scientist group, here is a product management group, here is an engineer group.
Many times I hear, like, especially I've been talking to companies recently to get this AI project so that my students can go build this as part of our capstone project. So one common theme is they would say, we don't have enough data scientists. Or they would say, our data scientists don't have the business acumen. They know we have data scientists, but they don't have the business acumen, which might not really be true. There is a disconnect in the conversation. The worst thing is they trust the data scientist, and the BU is working on some kind of pilot, and they kind of reach the place where it's not performing. The AI, they build some AI, it's not getting the results they want. Then they would say, we don't have enough data. So I've had situations where companies said, we have this model built, we need to throw more data at it. Can you bring external data? Can your students help fix it? I usually don't touch those because it's signaling an underlying problem that they don't have clarity on their workflow, got the right data, then started the process. So the problem statement itself is incorrect. And so it's not my job, and I don't want my students to get involved in that unless they're already in a job situation like that. Do you see that not having, I like how you said having enough cross-functional talent, because the way we are trying to do our classes is, we have people from all kinds of background who bring their different perspective. And so it is not just one perspective, and so it helps even shape the business problem right before we get to the data science stage. So do you see that as a bigger problem when they say lack of talent?
Yes, it is, because most failures, the way they happen, they focus on the wrong type of talent at the wrong time, right? By the time you get to the point and you say, I don't have the right data scientist, that clearly means the company is trying to make a scapegoat of some upstream problems where the problem actually originated. By the time you come down to the stage where you're saying, hey, I have an AI solution that is not working, or don't have enough data, or I'm struggling to build the ROI, that's way downstream.
Yeah.
That's a failure in the leadership. Should have caught that way earlier upstream, if you will, to say, do I have the right problem? Do I have the right team set in place? So for example, in some cases where AI failed was the product teams did a wonderful job of building the solutions.
Yeah.
Excellent. And they even ran a couple of trials and pilots. Customers validated that, yep, that's what we wanted. The next step is, okay, how do I go commercialize? Now, the organizational structure is now set up. There is no sales force. There is no sales organization. There are no sales incentives. There are no partnerships. There is no marketing campaign or lead generation behind that. All of that was never really thought about. It doesn't mean you need to have solved all those answers right up front, but they should acknowledge that at some point, let's say at the trial stage or pilot stage or the beta stage, that's when the other organizations like sales, finance, manufacturing, fulfillment operations, and so on, support, they all come on board. Otherwise, what will happen is product is ready, nobody is ready to sell, and it takes another year for the team to go set up the commercial infrastructure to enable the success. And in the meantime, the data scientists or the technical talent will lose motivation, and they lose the engagement, and just they move on to something else.
I'm not even thinking at that senior level. We have this one project where we took customer data and said, okay, we want to increase revenue from users. And the team went through this whole exercise in our class about there are 4 different use cases. We could go in 4 different ways on building the AI. So essentially it's 4 different AI because AI is very narrow. But then they needed to test and iterate to see that it is working. So they could have built an AI and say, hey, it's performing at 80% confidence. That's just statistical confidence. And one of them involved the content team, one of them involved marketing, one of them involved sales and getting more partners. And they had to think about how actionable the AI was before they proceeded to even make it happen.
Yes. And I think that's a good example. One of the examples that I faced over the last several years was, for example, the most common solution you find in most companies is customer churn, right? Customers don't subscribe or renew their subscription, so they don't come back and renew their annual support, or don't buy your products or go buy competitors' product. It's a fairly common problem for last many years. I think financial industry has really perfected the art, and retail to some extent has perfected the AI when it comes to churn prediction. Now you take churn prediction and apply to your relevant enterprise industries or B2B, right? We talk about some, many cases we have seen successful AI models better to predict churn. But the problem statement did include the right people and the right data sets upfront. The problem with the data scientists is sometimes they're brilliant PhDs. And they love solving the problem, and they're perfectionists too, by the way, and they don't like anything that is less than perfect. And that's why we love them, because we can rely on them to build the best solution. The question then becomes is, who is complementing that data scientist's mindset? Who is complementing that? And that is where the marketing person or the salesperson who wants to know how much churn will I have, by how long? A simple question, sometimes simple questions like, do I need to know somebody will churn or not renew, or I'm going to lose some customer? Do I need to know that a day in advance, a week in advance, a month in advance, or a year in advance? The data science and the AI solution will be very different for each of these questions that I just mentioned. Predicting something 1 year in advance is going to be very different and probably a lot harder than trying to predict a churn a week in advance. Now, which of those questions or answers will help the marketing or the sales team create more economic value? Not having that understanding upfront will lead to some of these failures. And it seems kind of odd and trivial. So, Sai, why do you think, like, isn't it like, duh, shouldn't we be asking that question? You'll find surprisingly how often that happens, wherein that statement, what is the scope? What question are we trying to answer with this AI? Seems very trivial, but it's the hardest question, because most often the answers tend to be given in technical terms or in data science terms, not in business terms. Like I just gave the churn example, right? Same thing in other scenarios, by the way. I'm just giving churn as an example.
One thing especially with churn is, if you get too soon to think about it in data science terms, you can define churn as a classification problem, or you can define churn as an anomaly detection problem.
Yep.
And it would be building different AIs, solving for different kind of action that you can take from it. Yeah.
And I think,
sorry, I want to call on Jose to see whether he can just speak up his question, because he has a question. He's been waiting for a while. Jose, speak up. You should be able to just speak. We should be able to hear you.
Thank you. My comment is mostly related to the justification of business implication of the AI applications. And something that we struggle a lot typically is how do we justify these projects to leadership? And this is something very common and that I've faced before. And typically, there are some business analysis techniques such as venture capital or profits and loss and all of that. And those tend to work for software applications. And second, typically you mentioned the challenges from different competitors. And also I will add, or something that has worked for us is the competitive, the benchmark prices. There's typically different alternatives that have different costs, and building an AI solution maybe will save something. And the third solution that we have faced before, and it's something that Sudha is really teaching us, is a problem statement. Once the solution solves a problem or addresses a challenge from a competitor standpoint, it has helped to build a better easily justificable project. And I would like to ask you, according to your experience, what are other techniques or alternatives that you would recommend to justify such a project to leadership, instead of just going profit and losses and then increase revenues, things like that?
Yeah, I think typically, first and foremost, what I have done usefully is when I failed in some of these things, I realized I was trying to frame an AI product or AI solution as of having the same business maturity. I'm not talking technical maturity, business maturity or sales maturity as any other existing product in the incumbent company. Most of the companies that I worked at have already incumbent businesses that are billions of dollars in revenue. Now I'm bringing an AI product that is going to be a few million at best in the initial 1 or 2 years, when they have the billion-dollar products already sitting here, hundreds of millions and billions. So they're at this altitude, and while I'm bringing in something here. So the first thing we had to do is leadership. There is always some stakeholder in your company that what I have found is who is more growth and innovation driven. Not keep the lights on for existing businesses, but try to identify new businesses, new opportunities. Typically, that happens to be corporate BD or corporate M&A or corporate strategy groups. So it's a multi-pronged approach. So one of the things I've done is go work with them, get their allyship, if you will, get them on board to drive some growth and innovation. Second is what you already mentioned around competitive and everything. Third is work with salespeople and customers. Sometimes I found salespeople can be the last one to pick up a small product that is making only $1 million or $2 million when they have $1 billion business here. But you can identify some sales champions in some challenged industries where there is intense competition. And then you add 1 or 2 AI features, even to a hardware product. Forget about a software. Even sometimes they are only selling hardware, right? If you're in a medical business, you're selling medical instruments. If you're in aerospace, you're selling planes and parts or trucks, if you will, for the logistics business and so on. If there is a way you can use AI to increase the intelligence or the capability of that hardware or the piece of hardware as an example, even though you're not changing money, what we have done is we used to show the pull-through revenue for those solutions, working with specifically identified or targeted salespeople. So what happened there was the salespeople started to become our champions rather than just only the AI group trying to keep pushing. We were trying to build allies and network of people in the company, corporate BD as an example, some specific salespeople who are most challenged, but who benefit a little bit more in trying to close a deal by having this extra feature, if you will. And slowly use this with some quick wins. And at some point, these small incremental wins, right? We call them micro innovations, not macro, which means you make a 1% improvement here, 1% improvement here, 1% improvement here, but they soon add up. And you will reach a critical mass. Each company will have, each leadership will have different critical threshold or a mass. And the key is, can you get to that critical threshold to convince the leadership to invest in this even more by showing some quick incremental wins up to a point? So pull-through revenue is one good way of showing something when you don't have direct revenue potential, Or even if there is a direct revenue potential, sometimes your organization and sales is just not set up to sell that. So pull through is one good way. And there are good well-known techniques in not AI, but BI techniques that can be applied to demonstrate the value of pull through. And once the pull through becomes valuable, even sales leadership I have seen, they don't want to leave money on the table. Once they see that, hey, you know what, this pull through didn't happen only like 2% of the time, now it is happening like 10, 15% of the time, they immediately turn around and say, hey, I don't want to give this away for included with the hardware or other software product. I want to charge for it as an add-on. So they have the add-on strategy. So they go from pull through, then move on to the add-on strategy where they start charging a little bit more, whether it is for the service or for the product or for the license. And then they test the waters out, and then they start stratifying their product solution, tiers of their product or service, like gold, bronze, silver. Think about it that way. So it is a step-by-step process. Very few people have the luxury, very few companies have the luxury of introducing a brand new product, AI only, and then start selling it for thousands of dollars per month per user right off the bat. That happens only in very few industries. Right.
So many
Even
of the,
in the
especially
big,
many of the IoT
Thank you.
companies are doing that, right? They are starting off with the hardware and then switching to a whole service model. Elevators are now sold more as a service instead of a big equipment, but they made the transition eventually, right? So
yeah.
I'm
In other
thinking
words, you should find a problem if it is external facing problem and not an internal facing problem. If it is an external facing problem, know your customer's workflow, and part of that workflow you should figure out how can you change it using AI in such a way that gives you such a unique a competitive advantage that others don't have. Right? I mean, I know this is probably not a relevant example, but I'll give you the Uber example, right? Uber, Lyft, and so on example. Why did those businesses thrive and others didn't thrive? Besides the business model, which was of course a huge advantage they had, but from a solution and a service perspective, that what differentiated them on the technology and the AI side was the AI that made their solution very competitive and efficient and effective than the alternatives that existed in the market. They may not have started using full-blown AI right in the first few years, by the way, but their whole strategy was built on data. It was the data that gave them the advantage of you getting your ride within a few minutes of you calling in, and you could track them, you could identify them, and that made it a lot more value for the customer to go adopt it. And similarly, even in the traditional B2B industries, if you know your customer's workflow, in this case, Uber and Lyft, they knew our workflows, what is the steps that we go through to get a taxi from a point A to point B. And in those steps, they figured out which of these steps in the workflow they are going to optimize using data and AI. Similarly, supply chain, utility operations, plant operations, yield and quality, or if you're in the medical hospital, think about triaging the number of patients that are coming in, especially like what is going on right now in the pandemic world, right? In the normal situation, when you walk into an ER, there are probably 5 or 6, maybe a dozen patients waiting in the ER. With the pandemic, suddenly they're getting like hundreds. How do you use AI and data to triage them without having only humans to triage them before deciding who needs to be admitted, who can be sent home safely?
Yep. And I noticed Mamta is here. Mamta had spoken about AI product management to our class. And one of the things that stuck with us is when they're building AI at some micro level and say, how is it performing? If you start with thinking about the success of the AI is to improve the yield or solve a problem and have a metric, which is a business metric, a low performing AI algorithm can still meet your business needs. And you don't need a high performing AI to get started with. So it's possible that you could have a 20% performing AI algorithm, but it might get you the 10% yield that you're looking for, which means you can go back and optimize more, which is a very different mindset than what I'm seeing outside typically, right? Because if you start from the data scientists and you said they're perfectionists, it will never get out to test it out with the real customer. So do you see a challenge in getting AI tested out with real customers, or do you always suggest that you start with real customer, get a customer who's ready to work with you, who has an innovative mindset before thinking of pull-through revenue? And obviously you'll get the pull-through revenue if you deliver for the customer.
Yeah. It's kind of, most of the time, ideally, we would like to have a customer, and at least in real world and businesses that I have been in. We want to have the customer upfront, but it's not always possible or practical. So we tend to do those two things in parallel. In some industries, it's pretty more ready. For example, in the medical industry, it tends to be a little bit easier because you have a lot of customers and hospitals who have real problems, and they're constantly looking for a solution. So it's kind of like co-development or co-innovation, if you will. But in where the sales cycles tend to be different. But if you are working in a completely different environment, as an example, like when you go to aerospace or aeronautics or aircraft manufacturers, they tend to have such a long product development cycle where we don't find it very economically attractive to engage in working on something that takes so long. Yeah. So what I mean by that is you need to do both in parallel, wherein you start doing it something in-house, but simultaneously start sourcing for co-developers or customers.
So I remember Mr. Varga, who teaches, Alexander Varga, who teaches our AV data course online here. He always tells us when they say, here is the success story, and this is, we read case studies and we talk about the success of an AI project, the metric that a vendor would use is going to be very different from what a customer would say. Finally, the customer wants to have seen that result executed and delivered. Only then they'll pay for it. It's not like you build a project and you say, here's a pilot, it worked with this customer, go back, and you could use that to get buy-in. But if it doesn't go through and get continuous results, the customer is not going to pay for it, and you can't scale real business.
Yeah, and sometimes it's okay for the first one or two customers. See, this should be part of your strategy, which is first one or two customers, don't expect them to pay. You can think of them as your marketing investment. If you didn't have the customers, you'd be spending a lot on marketing, websites, campaigns, lead generation, and you'd be spending a ton of money on that anyway. Now you're using that money and funding, and you're diverting this to do a different kind of marketing investment as to a co-list or enlist. So I see we are past our time here now, 10 o'clock.
Yes, we should wrap up. Do you have, I just saw a couple people want to leave and they're saying fantastic session. Mamta was saying this validates, especially her observation about ROI. And Jose had this question, and, he was saying, he loved the presentation. He found it very useful. So before you leave, I think we can, have a long conversation with you for many hours and still we have barely scratched the surface. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for your, open, insightful Q&A here today. Is there any advice you would leave the class, especially they are trying to, move into AI space from various different business roles that you've been giving us examples? What would be a starting point? They are not the C-level execs yet, right? And they see the resistance from middle management, and they also see the potential in their business, but they want to bring AI and iterate and get the business to get to a place where it's of value for them. What advice do you have for them?
Well, a couple of things. I think most of us tend to do. One advice is, if you think there is a silver bullet, then I think it's good you get off that bandwagon as soon as possible. There's no silver bullet, especially in companies where they're already not bought into AI. If the company is already bought into AI, your job is a lot simpler. So I would say there's no silver bullet, but think about micro innovations, quick, small string of innovations and wins that you can use to build on the total value proposition of AI for your company. Of course, lay down the big vision and the big roadmap, if you will, but start small. And then use some practical steps that may or may not sound like too groundbreaking or in the concept of micro innovation, groundbreaking, or if you will, moving the needle significantly initially, but think outside your own particular group and look to other allies in your company for driving success of AI, whether it is BD, corporate strategy, partnership organizations, sales organizations. And I think instead of just relying only in your data scientists and other groups, that will probably help you get there sooner.
Yeah. That is one thing I tell my students, because some of them are in BD, some of them are in marketing. So we try to bring a cross-functional team to work on this problem statement exercise. And each of them have different deliverable on how they've learned AI in the exercise. So you're saying they need to partner with other business people who are actually going to apply the AI and make it successful. They need to think about it ahead of time. That's fantastic. So with that, I think we should wrap up, and people are just saying thank you, and it's fantastic. They love the presentation. Thank you so much, Sai. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, appreciate it.
Is it all right if people connect with you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, people, and Sneha will be here next week, hopefully. So thank you, everybody. And I will see you online. And just a reminder that at Weekly Wednesday on, now we are calling it Business School of AI because we've expanded past AV courses to AI courses. So in Business School of AI, if you go to the courses section and look at Weekly Wednesday, this recording will go live, and by Sunday morning, you should be able to find it. I just want to make sure that the speakers get to see it and approve the recording. And I will see you on all next Wednesday. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Stay safe.